Hey everyone, welcome to Asterix's next instantiation of Ask Me Anything. But today we have Dr. Chase Cunningham with us, who is Dr. Zero Trust. The point of this Ask Me Anything is around zero trust, the zero trust framework, and how it applies to non-human identities specifically, where the overlap comes from. Just introduce myself before I introduce Chase. My name is Michael Silva. I run solution engineering here at Asterix. Host this series moving forward. My guest today is Dr. Chase Cunningham. I'll let Chase introduce himself.
Sure. So Chase Cunningham, our retired Navy crypto guy, worked at NSA after that. Then I was at Forrester Research. And since then, I've just been out on the market, kind of doing my own thing, publishing books and causing general discontent whenever I can.
Awesome. Awesome. So we have 30 minutes. Again, for those coming in the lobby, this isn't Ask Me Anything. We'll talk for the first 5 minutes about the general problem, what zero trust means and how it overlays with non-human identities. Thank you for those who pre-submitted questions into when you registered. We do have those here. If you do want to ask further questions, please put them into the Q&A. We'll answer as many as we can get to inside of this 30-minute window. So, to kick it off, Chase, zero trust, right? Talk to us a little bit about the principles of zero trust in your words. And then after you go through the principles, which ones that you have found that, identity teams have struggled with, or any teams have struggled with to kind of manage non-human identities along with them.
I mean, and for me, the simplest thing about zero trust is think about it from the context of hopefully how you kind of live your life in the physical world. You typically make sure people are who they say they are. If some just rando shows up at your front door and says, "Hey, I'm here to fix the plumbing," you kind of would sit there and go, "Well, wait a minute, did I have a plumbing problem?" Okay, yes. And then you go look at the truck and you make sure that the truck is from a company that has a logo on the side. And then you're going to say, well, what's your name and give me your information or whatever else. And then you're going to verify. And then that person's going to be allowed to come in and fix the plumbing. And then you're going to make them leave. Like that's a session-based control, unless you want plumbers living in your house, which maybe that's, the thing you want. But the truth of the matter is this is a way that we live. And this is a way that you should be kind of thinking about stuff. Like it for me is still difficult for folks to say that this doesn't make sense in the digital realm. You live this way in the physical world. We're just digitizing it. And then now if I abstract away on that whole plumber thing, imagine you had 1,000 plumbers show up at once and you're
Yeah.
going, right. So, but that's what we deal with in cloud, and then, oh, by the way, of 1,000 of those plumbers, 887 of them are robots. Like, how do you deal with that? So, I mean, it gets kind of crazy and out of control. But that's the world we live in. That's the space that we, deal with. I think identity for me is, while I don't necessarily agree that it's the perimeter per se, I think identity is the engine or the gear that this whole mechanism revolves around.
Yeah, and I think where you hit a key point, right? So identity being the perimeter, right? We hear that a lot in different talks and articles, right? I think you touched on a really key point, especially when it comes to non-human identities, right? Which is being a linchpin to connecting these systems, right? You talked about cloud, right? When a lot of people hear about zero trust, the instant thought is microsegmentation and networking, right? But there's a lot that comes with zero trust, and NHIs, whether they are API keys, whether they are app extensions, whether they're service accounts, OAuth connections, that are actually connecting these disparate systems to speak to each other, right? Are they allowing data access to come across, unverified, unconnected? Are they coming from, outside the network? Are they coming from inside the network, right? So we start talking about, API keys and, probably, understanding, how do we apply least privilege to identities that really have persistent access. There's not really a human in the loop to say, hey, I'm verifying this or running a control around. It's like, what do you say to those that you consulted for, or dealt with, or in your personal experience when they say, how do I provide the continuous monitoring? How do I provide the least privilege to these different identities that kind of go unnoticed and unfettered?
Well, you can't do this with Ricky the intern in a spreadsheet. I mean, the days of doing this stuff manually are just impossible. That's why if you look at all the guidance and all the documentation and all the conceptual approaches to this, it makes sense. It's going to have technology. You're going to do this at a policy level. You're implementing apps and development processes. Excuse me, I don't want a problem with that, but processes and those things. Why wouldn't you have a same sort of approach for managing all those things? And really, if you said nothing else, if I just at least know what's up and what's talking and what's anomalous, I'm in a better position. I may not have to have total fidelity, but if all of a sudden things don't look like what you would consider to be normal, that gives you an ability to reach out and control things. And that's why the spreadsheet mechanism doesn't work. You can't fix stuff at a scale of thousands of burstable actions with somebody manually going in and going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You need to be able to do this at policy. I mean, APIs and all these things are beautiful because they make stuff work. Why shouldn't we use them for security controls?
Yeah, and I think that's shameless plug, right? It is our webinar, right, for Asterisk, and kind of why we came to market, which is that continuous monitoring of non-human identities as they come into the system, right? Getting the full life cycle of not just the spreadsheet method of the past. When I used to work in SOX and work on different teams from that perspective, being a platform engineer, right? I would first inventory, I put in the CMDB, I would understand, hey, here's my change review request. I'm going to put this identity in, right, and it's going to have this permission. We expect it to do X, Y, and Z, right? And then if there's a breach, it will come through the SIM. It will we'll get some sort of alert. Maybe we've done some great event-based monitoring from that point of view, but there's really just a giant gap in between that Asterisk is looking to solve, which is how do I look at these API keys? How do I look at these service accounts and not have to play the screen test game anymore? Not have to say, I don't know what Dave's DB test goes to, right? So no one's responded to my last 17 emails. I brought it up in change review boards. No one knows what this thing does. Let's pull the plug and see what happens, right? Let's see who screams.
And,
And
and
that
no one does, right? Then what was the
Yeah,
problem? I mean, that's
yeah.
that's the one that I think people don't consider enough, is if I do pull the plug and no one freaks out, we definitely should have had something in there before.
100%. So we get back to the continuous monitoring principle, right? Then we get back to if I do continuous monitoring, how do I know if I'm applying least privilege to this account, right? All these different principles start to pop up when we start tying it back to zero trust, which are very, very hard to do without a solution in place, right? I've experienced that pain before. I know others, watch this webinar are experiencing this pain right now, right? It's a very powerful framework to put in place. It does protect you in a lot of different areas, but doesn't mean it's easy, especially when it comes to identity. When a principle was not built for identity to start with, now you're trying to apply it to the rest of the system. Kind of go from there. So I'm going to start popping in some of these questions. We have a lot in the queue right now. So this is a good one, right? Let's get one of the slightly controversial ones out of the way. We'd love to focus on non-human identities, but those who call it a repackaged marketing or problems we already know about, how do we address that, right? And I think Chase, you and I are uniquely open to that conversation only because we've had it before, and we had it when we did our NHI conference back in New York, right? We talked about the report that the Cloud Security Alliance did on non-human identities, and found out that there are other tools that will capture some pieces of non-human identities, whether they are your CNAP, your SSPM, your PAM, your IGA, your API security tool, your zero trust, whatever tool you're using, to kind of put those mechanisms in place. The problem is that it's super fragmented, right? They are either fragmented from the point of only looking at a piece of the problem. They're only looking at 2 of the 12 use cases that you really need to know. Maybe they're only looking at a certain vertical: cloud only, SaaS only, on-prem only, right? And it leaves we just talked about in the last second. What does it mean to actually talk about NHIs when it comes to zero trust is they're the linchpin, right? They don't live just within the corridor of, hey, this is a key I made for my SaaS environment. It's only going to live in GitHub, right? No, that GitHub is key, maybe used to deploy out to cloud, maybe used to pull artifacts from a different location, right? So but I'll let you kind of take a swing at this again. But what do you say to those that say, we already kind of solved this problem? Why are we talking about it now?
If we solved it, there wouldn't be a whole bunch of VCs throwing their money in there because there's a market to be developed, which is a pretty solid answer. And I think too that a lot of folks, we live in a space where you operate at the speed of kind of the internet. So we expect things to have happened in a very limited scope of time in our heads, where in reality, if you look at what we've done in cyber, I mean, as far as an infantile sector of technology, this is it. And folks, oh, it's repackaged. Well, no, we started out with like firewalls and network, and we've migrated to these other things. And as we've identified risks and problems and issues, we have come up with new terminology and new things to solve those issues. It will continue. I mean, that's the good thing is this is a space where it's going to continue to evolve and get hopefully better and et cetera. But if people are putting the snark on it for a repackaged, repurposed marketing term, you're not giving it enough honest sort of look at stuff, and you're not really looking at the reality of the problem. And I think it's good, honestly, to have a non-human side of it, because
Mhm.
identity for a user is a whole different ball of wax than if I go off and figure out an issue with a non-human side of the equation. I can deal with non-humans griping way easier than I can deal with humans griping.
Yeah, yeah, they don't talk back as much, right?
Exactly. They do what they're
Um,
told, which is awesome.
yeah, and then the next question that came in, kind of talks about the intersection of those two pieces. So thank you for everyone in the chat for lining us up pretty perfectly here, right? Which is what does it mean to actually have ownership of NHIs when they come in, and kind of talk about the importance of that. What does it mean to say, we have humans in the system, we have all these NHIs, but we talk about bring it back to zero trust, right? Inventory monitoring and full life cycle, right? The importance of what does it mean to assign human ownership, and from a inventory and life cycle perspective.
I mean, this is such a dynamic side of the equation where things are evolving and growing so fast. I mean, burstable infrastructure, Kubernetes, cloud, API, all the other sides of the equation that we deal with constantly is where it gets really interesting really fast. So the ability to keep a running inventory and a running understanding of what's going on, I think becomes even more critical. And I mean, now you don't even have to be a person that understands the very basics of software development or application development or security. You can go into one of the GPTs and say, build me an application that will track, dog turds on my run, and it will build it for you. And then you've got the
Mhm.
issues to deal with all that. And there's infrastructure that runs everything. So it continues to push, I think, is really where we're going. And speed is the issue. Speed and scale are the real problems. When it was one of one, solvable, but now it's not.
Yeah. Yeah, and you kind of touched on another point where you start talking about the Gen AI, and I call them, the GPT developers out there who, now that they have the power of development and they have an idea, right? It's not going to be the world's greatest code, but it may compile, right? And it's going to run, and it's going to have a connection to something valuable. So we talked about the ownership piece, right? When Asterix is looking at ownership, there's many pieces of ownership, right? There's who is the human who's responsible for this non-human identity, who is the human or humans who are consumers of this non-human identity, right? Who am I going to affect downstream if I rotate this key, if I delete this key, if I remove this key? And then when it comes to, when we have, joiner, mover, leaver, conversations of, hey, someone has moved to another part of the organization where they don't need to be hands-on keyboard. Maybe they move to a management position, right? Maybe they don't need all these API keys anymore or access to these service accounts. And also, when they leave the organization, right? What do they have access to? How can I tell they have access to it? And how do I tell when it gets, misused? If, we didn't leave on the best of terms, right? That comes down to the behavior piece. But there's also the part you brought up about the Gen AI and the connections, and everyone wanting to leverage Gen AI to make their jobs easier, right? So if we start looking at the different OAuth app connections or API connections, say, hey, read my email to make my Fridays easier. Read my sales ops. Tell me if I'm missing something. Read, whatever it may be. It doesn't have to just be in the tech word, but being able to fingerprint when that's happening, and then when we do have the ability to look at when a user is no longer part of the system, right? Are we also, can we reduce our attack surface, right? And by reducing our attack surface, a lot of the times when we think about NHIs or, or not us, but, when, owners of identity networks think about NHIs, so thinking about, okay, which keys do I give out internally? Which service accounts am I giving out internally? We don't think about the external attack surface. We don't think about, I need someone like Asterisk to connect to my system, right? How are they going to connect in? Did I provide them persistent access? Did I do that for HR apps, finance apps? Did I do it for all these different, ChatGPT apps that are connected to my system? Who is on the other end of that connection? And when I do have a user leave, how do I go ahead and I'm making sure that I'm also reducing attack surface and not leaving? We talked about Dave's DB test, right? If we pulled it and it had been around for 2 years and no one screamed when it went away, how long was that attack surface open? Was that only internal access? Was that external access? So it becomes huge when we start talking about that continuous monitoring.
I mean that, the whole thing about there's a literal pillar in zero trust for visibility analytics. So if you build a house minus a pillar, the house doesn't stand up too well. So, you need visibility analytics, being able to see what's going on. Otherwise, you're kind of in a bad place, to be perfectly frank.
Yeah, great question. I like that question. So it's good about the ownership piece here. Yeah, we'll hit another another one that will probably be near and dear to your heart. Um, for those who want to convince their leadership to start implementing zero trust, to start adhering to the framework, and maybe they get pushback or they preemptively fear the pushback will be, well, that's just a buzzword. That's not something we're going to do here. What do you say in those situations, which I'm sure you've had a bunch, right? What is the benefits? What are the the outcomes you can expect that they could push up to their upper levels of management and say, hey, this is something we should explore and why?
I mean, I think the biggest thing directly is don't go in and say we got to do zero trust. And I know that sounds counter to what most folks would expect, but even when I do like workshops, I don't talk about we're going to do zero trust and this is where we're going or whatever, because they may not agree with the terminology. The whole thing is about a real strategy. Is it something you can maneuver and manipulate for your own purposes? So that's why, like, I agree with you. You should lay out the research, the benefits, the business case, the plan, the program, the maturity model, the references, all those things, and figure out what the adaptation of your particular terminology is for it, and kind of like Jedi mind trick, right? Let people make their own decision based on this thing. And it's funny because when you do that, eventually you'll get to a spot where they align on it, and that's all you're looking for. I've done lots of workshops and I never once have said, we're going to do zero trust. I just lay out the reality and the practices and the business outcomes and those things. And then at the end, I let them, I don't care if they call it cyber tiddlywinks. Like, as long as we have a plan and a program in place, that's what matters.
Yeah. What do you see as, we talked about the pillars of zero trust. Where do you see as the path of least resistance? Let's say, I'm trying to get this in the door. I'm trying to push this above and say, like, this pillar, whether, it doesn't matter if we're risk driven, compliance driven, data driven, is there, I know there's no magic bullet to anything in life, but if you had to say, what is the closest to pillar that you're going to hit on most, and upper leadership, if they don't care, maybe it's a different warning sign for maybe an organization you're part of.
I mean, I think it's good that the DoD put governance as an eighth pillar within the space, because we needed it. And if you're trying to get people to move on something, legalities, compliance requirements, and the issues of the way that you do business are always going to resonate. So I think that that's where pushing that in front of people. And it's kind of crazy too when I've worked with folks and you say, you just had your compliance certification done for whatever, blah, blah. Has anyone changed a rule on anything at a policy level? And somebody always says yes. Okay, well, then your compliance, which is a snapshot in time, is pretty much invalidated. So you're doing business illegally in reality. And if you start talking to people about that, they start going, oh, okay. Now, does that mean that they have to freak out and shut business down? No, but it means that they should be aware of it. And it means that if you're trying to motivate people to move, the greatest cattle prod in human history is money and finance and legalities.
Yeah, no, that's true, right? And I would also say, going along with that, the compliance is always a major driver, right? Saying you need to spend X to get here, so you don't have to spend X and then spend X to get here, right? Because now you're going to get double hit because you failed audit or you failed legal, and now we still have to implement it, right? Let's get ahead of it. Is always a great one, and we start talking about non-humans and where they come into compliance. It used to be not too long ago when I was, sitting, trying to do these audits myself of, PCI, SOX, and NIST, and lining everything up to the minor attack framework and making sure that I'm covered on my end. It used to be, I'd make a Python script, I'd make a call to all these systems, I'd get a CSV output, and hand that to the auditor every 3 months or every half year, every year, and I'm good to go. Right from that point of view, maybe I do, I have a bunch of work in a couple of weeks, have sprint, maybe delegate it, do it, depending on what it is, and that was really it. It was only that I had to have an inventory and really, you know, go forward and understand what I have inside place, right? If you start looking at where PCI, where SOX, where NIST is now on NHI, right? It's really talking more about everything that used to be called local account or service account or some of that. Really, the messaging is changing, right? The messaging is changing to non-human identity, really calling out specifically different types of NHIs, and it's going from just inventory to the principles of zero trust, right? Which is continuous monitoring, least privilege. Are we? How do you confirm least privilege, right? What are you showing from that point of view? How do we show anomalous behavior, right? That's specifically called out in PCI 4.0 now. So we're seeing this intersection of zero trust and non-human identities starting to affect compliance, at the end of 2024 into 2025. So it's not something that you really have to make it up to get it in anymore, right? It's really part of the process now.
Yeah, and I mean,
Yeah,
there's
good.
no compliance document currently from anyone on zero trust, which I think is great because I don't want to be part of that. I don't think we should have a compliance initiative for it. But I do know from some of the working groups I've been in that are doing stuff at the federal level that there is a lot of look going into assimilating and optimizing all the many different legalities and requirements we have. So I think that folks should also be aware that there's some change coming their way, which is going to be good because it will streamline a lot of things, but it's also going to get rid of a lot of duplicative efforts. I mean, if you look at all these, NIST 800, 207 this, and ISO 27001 this, whatever, the same line items for the same controls are in the same document in different places for different-ish things. So that's why it sucks to have to do this stuff because you have to do it 4 or 5 different times for the same thing. So I think that that's worth knowing.
Yeah, and we had a live one come in a second ago, but I'm just asking for those who put it in about the policy and to just elaborate a little bit back into the chat. We will get to it, I promise. I'll save time for it, but just hit one more before we get back to other live question. Is how does this start to interact when we start looking at the Gen AI portion, right? The connection between my data stack, my compute stack, and these LLMs, right? Where does the enterprise need to have automated NHI security to really start to manage these connections that either exist today or are inevitably going to exist very soon?
I mean, it's such a crazy dynamic space that we're looking at right now with LLMs and those side. I'm still like, I mean, I consider myself relatively intelligent on this spot, and I'm trying to actually understand the intricacies of how those things are doing what they're doing, and then where the risks lie and how that translates into strategy. So it's I think we're literally defining that as we're along the fly. You know, we've been thrown off the cliff and someone said, build the plane. And we're working to get there before we hit the bottom. But
Yeah.
it's going to continue to evolve. And I mean, we need to accept the reality that these things are going to become as common as the internet is. Like part of your everyday life is going to be lived inside of these systems. So if you're not taking care of it now, you're not dealing with the true sort of issue that we face currently. And we all know that it doesn't work out for anyone that doesn't live in reality now. So
Yeah. All right. Great. And we have time for one question, and I promised. We had one come in from Jim here. Talking about policy engine and when we need to start implementing. Right. So the question is, do you need to have X policies? Right. So insert your policy of choice there. What are the metrics that you would include for doing a policy engine to help manage a whole environment for NHIs, right? And I'll take the first swing at that, right? So, we start talking about a policy engine, right? There's some, default ones, right? There's some ones that are easy from a policy engine perspective of, hey, do I have items that are overprivileged, right? Do I have items that are never set to expire? Do I have items that haven't been used in X amount of time, as we talked about before? Make sure we're, understanding the cleanup, right? There's some very, very simple ones. There's also ones that get more complex, right? There's policies of, lateral movement, ability to privilege escalate, the ability to, redundant access. Do I see from behavior that we have multiple items doing the same task, right? Do we need that, right? Is there a problem with our system? Do we have too many humans consuming the same identity, right? And this is where it starts getting to the ability to leverage an engine such as Asterisk to write your own policy, right? Write your own policy internally of, hey, are we following our own rules, right? Do we limit, a API key or a service account to be used by X amount of consumers? Do we, touch only a certain piece, right? We talk about, again, kind of crossing this over with zero trust, right? How do we understand that it's doing what it needs to do for a specific task, right? A specific piece, right? We're not letting it open up to other items that could allow for this type of effect. So, it really comes down to there's a lot of default policies, a lot of really good default policies that, just in general will clean up your system and make it, from there. But it's also leveraging the power of a tool like Asterisk, to not only inventory, assign ownership, monitor behavior, alert you on threats, right? Understand who's behind each connection, who's consuming each connection, but also providing you the ability to tell your own story, right? Tell your own story, apply your policies inside there, and make sure that you have the ability to make sure you're secure from your standard. Chase, I'll let you take the last minute here before we have to wrap up.
I mean, I think that I did a bunch of stuff with the Zero Trust Program Office, and the folks at the top were like, well, let's do Zero Trust policies. And the question was wrong, because what we said was, we don't do Zero Trust policies. We put technology in place. We learn what normal looks like. We get the total inventory. We understand the interactions, and then we apply policies based on the reality of what's going on. So to the question that was asked there, my answer would be, you don't start with the policy. You start with ingesting the information, getting good telemetry, understanding where things are interacting like you're talking about. And then at the end of the day, when you're good and you feel like you've got a really comprehensive map of what's going on and an understanding, then you apply the policies. And this should be scalpel, not sledgehammer. And that's what a good engine will do. I mean, that's why when we were working on the 800-207, a lot of folks were like, look at where everything sits in the middle. And that's really where the crux of it all comes together.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. And we're at the end of the live portion of the webinar. Thank you everyone for the amazing questions that came in. Hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully everyone learned something new and during this 30 minutes. We will continue to do these more and more. If you have any direct requests of how you want to have our next Ask Me Anything, feel free to reach out to me directly. Very responsive. Or let your local Asterisk region director know, and we'll go from there. Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Dr. Chase Cunningham, for lending us your time and experience today. Awesome. Thank you, everyone.